Hebrews chapter 11. We're going back to Hebrews 11. Oh, that's good. I'll turn that down a little bit. No sense frustrating everybody who's watching online. The myriad masses mess up the podcast. Benjamin will be yelling at me, Dad. Hebrews chapter 11. As we begin this morning, why don't we start with our memory verse, as we are wont to do. Hebrews chapter 11, located in verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. That is admittedly one of the hardest ones I've given you to remember, but it is as important as the rest of them are. Now, the other thing I'd like to review just before we jump in this morning is our definition of faith. Anybody remember without looking what that is? Faith is believing God. Right. If you learn nothing else this summer, you will learn what faith is. Inevitably, hopefully for the rest of your life. If somebody say, I don't know what faith is, and you will hear my voice echoing in your head, I'm sorry, saying, faith is believing God. And that's good. All right. So today, our tour through the Faith Hall of Fame brings us to a guy named Joseph. Now, I got to tell you, Joseph is kind of like a breath of fresh air in the area that we have been walking through lately, because Joseph, as people goes, was much better. He's one of those odd liars, and you're like, oddballs in the family, and you're like, this is the good one. You ever had anybody, oh, this is the good son? That's never been me. But, you know, you get somebody who's just, they're like weird compared to their family because they're so normal. That's Joseph. And so we find, as we go through our tour through the Faith Hall of Fame, we actually find his entry here in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. Now that seems almost morbid. I will grant you that. But to really get this story, we need to jump back to the book of Genesis, because like any of these, their entry, there's a lot more to the story than we're getting just off of the entry. So if we go back to Genesis chapter 37, we're going to tour basically 37 through 50. And so last week we did about 21 chapters. So this week we're doing about 23 chapters. Same chapters. We're just going to go through them with a different emphasis. We'll have them here on the screen, hopefully, Lord willing. But if you have your Bibles, that's good too. Genesis chapter 37. I want to pick up right in verse 1. We're introduced to this guy named Joseph. Now Jacob, I know it says now Jacob. We'll get there. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Now that sounds weird. That's actually not the beginning of Jacob's story. It's kind of the end of Jacob's story. You want some like nerdy Bible knowledge for a minute here? Can we go there? Okay, so this is what's called a Toledoth. 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 You say it's not in my page. It's not in my notes. Don't worry, it's not in my notes either. A Toledoth. What you have in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the ancient Bibles, were written on clay tablets, and clay tablets they're devilishly hard to carry around, and they're hard to index too. And so what they would actually do is these clay tablets were taken and they were placed in a box. And on the back of the last clay tablet, they would tell you what was in the box. Kind of like your file folders, hanging files, except, weighed a lot more. Kind of the same idea. And so that statement that tells you what was in that box, which happens to come at the end, not at the beginning, which is where we would be looking for it, is called the Toledoth. And this is the Toledoth. And you can find it several times through the book of Genesis. You'll see something that say, this is the story of Adam. It's at the end of the story of Adam. This is the story of Noah. It happened at the end of the story of Noah. This is the story of Jacob. This is the end of the story of Jacob, because we're really now going to focus on Joseph. Okay, so end of Bible nerding out. Anyway, so verse 2. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, see, we're moving on. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Sounds like our houses. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright." That doesn't happen often. "And indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now, we run into Joseph, and there are a lot of things that we need to see in this one short paragraph. First of all, we learn Joseph's age. He is 17 years old. Keep this one in the back of your head. There are a few time markers in Joseph's life, and they are significant. They're significant to this story, but they're significant because we don't get a lot of clearly defined time markers in the book of Genesis. Some of the history kind of overlaps and blends, and you find yourself saying, "How old are these people?" And you kind of have to work your way backwards and then guesstimate. He's 17 years old when this is being written in his life and the events that are soon to follow. We find that Joseph, I'm going to call him a bit idealistic, was the word I chose. You could call him a tattletale if you want to, and you wouldn't probably be wrong. But he was a bit idealistic, and I think of it this way because he had an ideal of what should be done, of what behavior was acceptable and what behavior was not acceptable. And when he saw behavior that was not acceptable, he dealt with it in the way that he knew how, which was go tell dad. So he was a tattletale, or he was idealistic, or he was both, probably. And I think that the description of Joseph as idealistic fits with his character and what we see in his life as we continue through it and kind of unpack it. We also learn that Joseph was the victim of his father. His father loved him more. Favoritism in this family was rampant. Every generation, the father picked one kid and said, "You're my favorite." That never works. Ever. Parents, if your kid says, "Who's your favorite child?" You don't have one. Even if you do, you don't. You get me? It's so unhealthy. It's the surest way to create toxicity in your home to say, "I have a favorite son or a favorite daughter or a favorite child." You can have a favorite cat. They're neurotic anyway. Who cares? But you may not have a favorite child. And so we find that Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. Now understand the family dynamic was a bit weird here. Jacob had 4 wives, and he loved one of them above the other 3. Okay, you know you're destined for trouble when I even say that, right? And so we find Joseph was actually the oldest son of his favorite wife. And he was born when Jacob was an older man. And so you have a bunch of things that kind of come together for this to be true. But in the end, this doesn't work out in Joseph's favor because his brothers aren't down with this idea. They don't like the idea, especially when dad goes ahead and makes Joseph this tunic of many colors and puts it on him. Now, there are symbolism and ideas that are with this tunic, but at the end of the day, all it is a walking advertisement that dad likes me more than he likes you. That's fantastic, isn't it? Not only do we know this, but you're going to wear that stupid coat and rub it in our faces. Now, did it mean that Joseph was going to receive the inheritance? Quite probably. Did it mean that Joseph was being elevated as a priest among his brethren? Quite probably. There was all kinds of symbolism, but at the end of the day, what it really meant to everybody was, Dad likes you better. It'd be like me taking one of my kids, and only one of my kids, and going clothes shopping with him and buying them all the fanciest, most expensivest clothes my credit card could possibly do. And the rest of the kids going, "Wow, you got that?" "Yeah, because I like them better." It's just not going to end well. It's not going to end well for me, and it's not going to end well for whichever kid I happen to pick. I mean, they may get more stuff, but they're going to get a lot more grief with their stuff, aren't they? And so this is Joseph's life. And then we find Joseph has a dream. And Joseph's dream isn't like your normal anchovy-induced, pizza dream. It's one of those dreams that seems to be very prophetic, and it's one of those dreams that seems to be God-given. I think we could see that in this dream, that this is something that God gave Joseph, and it's not something that actually occurred once. If we were to continue reading, and we're not going to right here, we would find that Joseph had another similar dream, but with the same basic result, that he was going to be elevated and that his family were going to come in under his authority, under his dominion. And his brothers were not real keen on the idea of little Joe, 11th in line, going to be the king over all of us. And they're thinking, that just ain't going to happen. But that was the dream that Joseph had. He had a dream of greatness. It was really a vision of greatness that God had given him. Now, soon after Joseph had these dreams and these visions and had the, I'm going to call it indiscretion of sharing it with his brothers. Again, he's idealistic. He's just happy about it. You should be happy too. Not really sure what they should have been happy about, but I think he thought they should have been happy for him, and that's why he shared it. And so right after he had these visions and these dreams, his brothers took the flocks and they went to another place because they had to feed them. One thing about sheep is they'll eat a field down to the grass or down to the roots, and then you got to kind of move on, let the field recover, and go find grass someplace else. And they're just like a lawnmower with no height adjustment. They just keep going, right? And so they're constantly moving around looking for greener pastures and places to graze, and so they do. And Jacob sends Joseph with lunch for his brothers, and I think with the idea that Joseph will look and not only find his brothers and give them the provisions he's sending, but he'll also kind of scope out what's going on and give him a true report of his brother's bad behavior, good behavior, whatever it happened to be. And so Joseph gets sent on this journey. And his brothers already hate him. I mean, you look in that passage, they hated him, and then they hated him more, and then they hated him even more. This is getting really bad. And so if we jump down to chapter 37, verse 23, so it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, they saw him come and had contrived a plan, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty, there was no water in it. So it wasn't like they cast him into a well. They cast him into a pit. Now, if you're in the Middle East and you're in a pit and there's no water, it is dry. And because there is also no shade, it is hot. And so this is already it's kind of a crucible experience, quite literally. As the sun comes up, it just beats on you. There is no place to go. There is nothing to drink. There is nothing to slate your thirst. It's just bad. And we find that their motive, their intention in this was, and they said it at the end of verse 20, we shall see what will become of his dreams. They were debating, should we kill him? Well, he is our brother. Should we free him? We really can't stomach that. And then they happened to find a solution that literally just walked by. Look at this in verse 28. Then Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. We will see what will become of his dreams. Now here's a question. What do you think was going to become of Joseph's dreams at the point where he has been sold into slavery? If you didn't know this story at all, and some of you I think don't, and that's cool. If you didn't hear the story before, what do you think would become of Joseph's dreams at the point that he is sold into slavery? Think they're going to come true? Here's a question. What do you think Joseph thought would become of his dreams? Now, we don't know. We're not told. This is pure conjecture. But Put yourself in his shoes. Got this dream of greatness. One of these days, my family is all going to come, and they're going to bow down before me. I'm not sure how that's going to work out, but I'm going to be king for a day over my family. Except that now I am leaving Canaan in chains, going to Egypt to be sold as a slave. What happens to his visions of greatness? What happens to those God-given prophetic dreams? Well, once in Egypt, we'll come back to the question. Once in Egypt, Joseph was sold to a man named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was one of Pharaoh's officers. He was captain of Pharaoh's guard. And he buys him and he just puts him into his house as unskilled labor. I mean, you think about it. Joseph's 17 years old. He knows how to tattletale. He probably knows a little bit about shepherding, except the Egyptians do cattle, not sheep. And he doesn't speak Egyptian, so he's just out hired hand. But Joseph, as he's there in Potiphar's house, in Potiphar's fields, after a while, begins to rise through the ranks as he adapts to the language and to the culture and to the people around him. As he matures through this experience and the experiences that he's facing, he begins to kind of rise through the ranks. And over a period of several years, gets to the place where he goes from the fields into the house to getting to the place where he is actually managing Potiphar's household for him. Potiphar focuses wholly on career. He doesn't have to worry about home life at all because Joseph has that sorted out. All he cared about was he came home and there was food on the table. Everything he owned was being multiplied. He didn't even care about it. He wasn't watching it because Joseph was just that good. So it seems like Joseph's making a bit of recovery. Granted, he's no longer in Canaan. He's no longer with his family. He is still a slave. But he's achieved about as high a position as a slave that you can achieve. So it's a bit of a recovery, not quite to where he was. I mean, you know, a broke free person and a rich slave, which do you choose? They're almost on par, but I think broke free person's probably better. So it's kind of a recovery. But then Joseph finds himself falsely accused and unjustly thrown into prison. That's going to delay things, isn't it? Because he's actually just been demoted. I'm going to go now from slave to prisoner in the country of my slavery. So even if he got out, he's still going to be just a slave. I mean, that's about as much as he can hope for. Now, the prison, the jailer, the keeper of the prison that he was put in, was somebody who at least knew Potiphar, probably worked for Potiphar. As the captain of the king's guard, this is the jailer where the king's prisoners were kept. And so this is probably somebody who works for Potiphar. At the very least, it's somebody who knows Potiphar. Here's a guy who probably has met Joseph before, having interacted socially with Potiphar. If not personally met him, definitely knew him by reputation. Very rapidly, we find that he checks into his office and never to return again because Joseph's here, and he goes, Joseph, run the joint. I'm going to be in my office playing solitaire. Or whatever the Egyptians did in the pre-electricity era. I don't know. And so Joseph very rapidly rises to the top of the ranks in prison. So it's a bit of a recovery of sorts, but let's face it, top prisoner, really not that big a deal, is it? Congratulations, you get one more rat than the rest for dinner. You get the freshest straw that was only used by the camels before it got to the prison. Once you're done with it, we'll pass it along to the next guy. Yeah, I mean, it's just not really all that in a bag of chips. But, here he is. He's risen to the top as much as he could. Time goes on, and we're not sure exactly how much time he spent in Potiphar's house. We know that he was about 17 when this whole story kicked off. Time goes on. Our next time marker is still a little bit away. But it happened as Joseph was there in the prison, keeping the prison, administrating the prison, that Pharaoh had a dream one night. And it was a dream that Pharaoh did not understand. And so Pharaoh, as he was wont, called in his advisors. He shared with them the dream that he had had, and none of them understood it either. And then suddenly, the guy who was Pharaoh's cupbearer remembered that a couple years ago he had been in prison where Joseph was running the place, and that he had had a dream, and Joseph had interpreted the dream for him, and that, oh yeah, a couple years ago he was supposed to mention Joseph to Pharaoh but forgot. Great time. So Joseph's been in jail for at least 2 years. And he goes, oh, I remember this guy can interpret dreams. And so they very rapidly, they call Joseph and they bathe him and they shave him and they dress him. And they probably put on some guy liner because that's what you do in Egypt. And they bring him up to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, we find in chapter 41 and verse 14, Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. The guy liner, it must be in Hebrew. Nothing? Really? And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you can understand a dream to interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, and this is almost prophetic in the answer. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Not just an answer of peace. And so Pharaoh recounted his dream for Egypt, and Joseph, as he heard it, immediately was given understanding by God to understand what the dream meant. And what the dream meant was this, that Egypt was going to have 7 years of harvests that were more bountiful than they had on the record books. It was just going to be 7 years of staggering plenty. And then those 7 years were going to be followed by 7 years of extreme and dire famine and drought. So much so that the 7 years of bounty wouldn't even be remembered. It was going to be that extremely bad. And then, having interpreted the dream, Joseph overstepped the instruction given him by Pharaoh and took it upon himself to advise Pharaoh. Pharaoh's instruction was, interpret the dream. Joseph interpreted the dream, and then he said, here, let me tell you what you need to do as a result of this interpretation. He goes from interpreting to advising just like that. And we find it, excuse me, in verse 33 of chapter 41. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all of the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let him keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. Now, Pharaoh didn't ask for advice. He just asked for interpretation. But Pharaoh was not an idiot. And Pharaoh understood good advice when he heard it, regardless of the source. And even if it was coming from a former slave and a former prisoner, if it was good advice, then Pharaoh was smart enough to take it. You know, a humble person can learn from anybody. One of the tragedies of our generation and our day in political correctness that has been run amok is we find people who are objectionable to us, and so we turn them off as sources of inspiration and knowledge. And I think we do that to our own discredit. Because the things that they knew and the things that they understood and the things that they can teach us could help us maybe to avoid some of the mistakes they made. You can learn from somebody even if you disagree with them. And that's, religious leaders that fall, we can learn from them. Political leaders that fall, we can learn from them. College people who are in college, we can learn from them. You can learn from somebody who owned slaves during the Civil War that fought on the wrong side. Did you know that? There was good God-fearing people who had a really bad idea on slavery, who got some things wrong but had a lot of things right. We could learn from them. We don't need to desecrate their memorials. But we as a people seem to be run by political correctness, run amok. I don't agree with slavery. I think you understand that. But there were good men who owned slaves who we could learn from. There were good men who have had moral failings that we could learn from, right? We get that? That's not even a political statement, is it? That's just good thinking. And that's where Pharaoh was. He was in that good thinking. He's like, this guy's a slave. He's a Hebrew. He likes lamb, and I hate lamb. And he's a prisoner. Here's Pharaoh's reaction in verse 37. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Now that's a recovery. Right? That's a promotion. That is like we're in Disneyland now. This is crazy that somebody would go from, impoverished teenager to slave to prisoner to grand, vice president, grand vizier, prime minister, call it whatever you want. None of those titles are all in English, so we know it's not the right title. But Pharaoh said, "You're going to run the whole land now. I'll sit here on my throne. You go run the land." That's what he just told him. And he put Pharaoh's signet ring on Joseph's hand, which means Joseph now has the ability and power to write laws and pass them without asking, because he's got Pharaoh's signature. And frankly, Pharaoh didn't want to know. He's like, "You make it happen. You figure it out. You run my land. I think you're the best guy for the job. I just met you, but I think you'll do great. I'll be right here on my throne if you need." That's a recovery, isn't it? It set in motion the direct fulfillment of Joseph's vision. We get a time marker then. Genesis chapter 41, verse 46. Look at this. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old. He was 17 years old when he had this vision. He's now 30 years. He's been sold into slavery, spent at least a couple years in prison, and now he's running all the land of Egypt. Has his vision been fulfilled yet? No, because his vision was very specific, that it would be his brothers who bowed before him. It's been 13 years. After that 13 years, the 7 years of bounty began. And Joseph administered the land of Egypt, collected grain like a madman until he left off counting. It was just too much. It's been 20 years. The famine starts as prophesied. You get through the first season, everybody's pretty good. They knew it was coming. They stored up grain. By the time you hit the second season, already we're starting to have some bumps. Pharaoh says to the people of Egypt, "You want food? Go see Joseph. He's the one that's got all the food. I'm just sitting here on my throne." And so Joseph starts a feeding program for the people. In at least the second, maybe the third year, his brothers show up. Guess who they have to talk to get grain? 13 years before he stood before Pharaoh. 7 years at least, probably 9. That's 22 years. At a minimum, maybe 23. And Joseph's brothers walk up. They didn't walk in. They walk up to where Joseph was seated. Joseph, who speaks Egyptian fluently, wears guy liner like anybody. Has the whole shaved thing and the linen skirt and does this when he walks. I don't know how you do that even. Anyway. They don't know it's Joseph. They just see an impressive Egyptian official that they have to try to buy grain from. They walk up to Joseph, and what do? They bow. 22 years later. Joseph's vision comes to pass. You ever had to wait 22 years for anything? Let's be honest, we're not very good at waiting, are we? If I have to wait more than 22 seconds for that burrito in the microwave, I'm already pacing. Come on, you've been there. Joseph's visions were eventually fulfilled. His family bowed before him. His family were then relocated from Canaan down to the land of Goshen in northern Egypt because the famine was still had 4 or 5 years to run its course, and Joseph wanted to take care of his family. And so the whole family moves down. Jacob is in Egypt for about 17 years before he eventually dies. The story kind of fast forwards, and we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 50. Beginning in verse 22, Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. All but 17 of those years in Egypt. He never went home again. He lived for 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the 3rd generation. The children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Joseph understood, though God had not renewed this covenant with him personally, he understood that God had made a covenant with Abraham that had been renewed to Isaac and had been renewed to Jacob, and that if God renewed this covenant over 3 generations, the covenant said specifically, you're going to live in this land. Your people are going to be in the land of Canaan. They're going to be multiplied like the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky. Joseph knew this and understood this to be true. And so he said, look, God's going to take you from this land, and he's eventually going to take you back to the land of Canaan. And Joseph, in verse 25, took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And so Joseph's story ends there, in Egypt, knowing that God is eventually going to carry the people of Israel out of Egypt back to their promised land in Canaan. And so he makes them make a vow, when you go, take my body with you, bury me in my father's tomb. Don't leave me here. So if you ever go to Egypt looking for Joseph's tomb, you're not going to find it. Because his last wish was not to be interred permanently in Egypt, but to be interred permanently in Canaan. If you find the grave of Abraham, you'll find probably 7 people. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, and Joseph. And 2 of those people will have been embalmed. Jacob and Joseph. Here's a question. How good are we waiting? Because Joseph, coming back to our text in Hebrews chapter 11, said one of these days God is going to carry you out of the land of Egypt back to the land of Canaan. How long after Joseph uttered those words did that event take place? About 300 years. That's a long time. And the people had become slaves themselves, and they had rather thought God had forgotten about them altogether. They had no realistic hope or plan of ever leaving Egypt. They'd stopped waiting, and they just resigned themselves to their fate. But God wasn't done. The promise that he made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob was still in full force and effect. God was going to take them out. Joseph knew it, even though he was on his deathbed. Because Joseph was good at waiting. God had given him a vision, and it took 22 years for that vision to come to pass. It took several detours through slavery and imprisonment. But there's nothing in this story that ever suggests that Joseph thought for a moment that God wasn't going to bring the vision to pass. Joseph had the faith to wait. He believed God enough to wait for God. Boy, isn't that kind of faith that we wish we had sometimes? That God makes a promise to us, and He doesn't fulfill it in 5 minutes or even 5 days, and about 5 weeks is the max of our attention span, and we just assume that God didn't really mean that, or God didn't really say that, or God forgot, or God just can't. Because we don't have the faith to wait. To believe God enough to wait for God. You see, God's timing is not like our time. We have this overriding sense of mortality that life just moves rapidly, and if things don't happen quickly, they're just not going to happen at all. God is eternal, and He has a very different perspective on time than we do. For starters, He's not worried about it. He's got His plan, and it may take time. How are we at waiting? It has been said that faith is believing God will do what He said He will do, even when it doesn't look like He will. That's faith. What are the areas in our lives that God has spoken into? That we have a promise, that we have a clear word, that we have a clear direction, we have a clear understanding, that God said do this, God said this is going to happen, and it hasn't happened yet. They're there, aren't they? I see it on your faces. Do we have the faith to wait? To continue to believe that God is going to do what God said He was going to do. Even though we've just gone from freedom to slavery, or from slavery to imprisonment, or for that matter, from imprisonment to serious promotion, because on paper that didn't get him any closer to fulfilling the vision. Do we have enough faith to wait for God? So often the troubles that we have are because we didn't, and we take it upon ourselves to help God fulfill His plan. We see that replete in the stories of the patriarchs. There's a prophecy. God doesn't look like He's doing it. I better do something for Him. God doesn't look like He's going to get that done. I think I'll go do it. What happens when we help God out? Inevitably, we screw it up. And then He has to fix it. And we get to wait longer because He had to fix it. Do we have the faith to wait? Father, I love You. I thank You for Joseph. I thank You that he is that breath of fresh air in this narrative. Lord, I look at the ability that he had to wait, and it is admirable. Father, I know in my own life I'm impatient. And I think speaking for all of us, we would confess our impatience. Would You help us to believe You enough to wait for You? Help us this week to work for You even as we wait for You. Father, to invite others to join us here so that they might come to know You as Savior, so that they might have the opportunity to have You sort out their lives like You've done for us. But Father, help us to be patient, understanding that Your time is not like ours. And remember that if You've given us a promise, it's an absolute. And if we'll but wait, You will fulfill it. Thank You for that. Thank You for Your faithfulness, even in the face of our impatience. Would You give us a great week, we pray in Jesus' good name.